Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. We're jumping right in today because we are tracking one of the absolute most epic, dramatic transformations in world history. We're talking about the rise and fall of the Maratha Empire. We're going to explore exactly how this formidable, unified state rose up to become the ultimate successor to the mighty Mughals, only to fracture completely and fall to the British East India Company. It is literally a masterclass in why structure, unity, and economic adaptation are absolutely crucial.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the rise of the Peshwas, examine that devastating turning point at Panipat, navigate the complex First Anglo-Maratha War, witness the final defeats, and finally, unpack the core reasons why this incredibly powerful empire ultimately lost.
All right, part one, the rise of the Peshwas. What's super interesting about this early era is just how power was initially structured, and how that structure fundamentally changed over time.
Right, so thinking back to the founder of the Maratha state, Shivaji, he brilliantly centralized power by creating what was called the Ashta-Pradhan. This was basically a council of 8 ministers. You had the Peshwa, which is like the prime minister, working alongside dedicated roles for foreign affairs, justice, intelligence, the whole shebang. It was an incredibly well-organized, secular state. But after Shivaji passed away, that carefully balanced dynamic basically vanished, and power consolidated almost entirely into the hands of the Peshwa.
And this brings us directly into the era of the early, incredibly powerful Peshwas. From 1713 to 1720, you have Balaji Vishwanath, who essentially served as the second founder of the state. Following him was Baji Rao I, an absolute master of guerrilla warfare. And finally, Baji Rao took the reins until 1761. Under these 3 leaders, the Marathas didn't just grow, they became the most powerful successors to the Mughals, and, crucially, the single biggest challenge to the British.
Moving on to part 2, the turning point at Panipat. We're fast-forwarding to 1761, which is a dramatic midpoint crisis that forever altered the trajectory of this empire.
Well, as you probably know, aggressive expansion usually leads to some intense friction. Under Balaji Bajirao, a massive territorial dispute erupted over Sindh and Punjab with the Afghan ruler Ahmed Shah Abdali. See, the Marathas had secured the right to collect chatho, which is a regional tax, and they actually went as far as expelling Abdali's governor. This was a direct provocation, and it dragged them straight into the disastrous Third Battle of Panipat in 1761.
It was a total devastation. The Maratha military commanders Vishwasrao and Sadashivrao both perished. Abdali was simply a superior general. And this moment brilliantly illustrates a crucial realization from the historical records. The Battle of Panipat didn't decide who was going to rule India, but it absolutely decided who was not to rule India, and that was the Marathas. The ultimate beneficiary of this crushing defeat wasn't even the Afghans, it was the English.
So, what does this all mean for the empire? Well, after Panipat, the shape of the state began to fundamentally change. We go from that unified, centralized Ashta-Pradhan of Shivaji's time to a much looser structure. The new leader, Maratha Rao, made the pivotal and ultimately fatal decision to hand military power down to the regional levels. The empire began to rapidly decentralize.
Power essentially splintered across the whole region, almost like a giant puzzle breaking apart. The Peshwa remained in Pune, sure, but now you had the Scindia family controlling Gwalior, the Holkars taking Indore, the Bonsleys holding Nagpur, and the Gaikwads commanding Baroda. Now, at the time, this might have seemed like a really pragmatic way to manage such a vast territory, but it actually planted the fatal seeds of disunity.
Which brings us to part 3, the First Anglo-Maratha War. Because naturally, this massive decentralization and internal competition basically rolled out a red carpet for foreign interference.
After Madhav Rao died, a really messy succession fight broke out between Raghunath Rao and Narayan Rao over who would be the next Peshwa. Raghunath Rao actually sought English support and signed the Treaty of Surat in 1775, basically handing the English troops and territories if they just recognized him as Peshwa. But then, the British Governor-General Warren Hastings completely rejected it and signed a totally different treaty, the Treaty of Purunder, in 1776. This tangled web of competing treaties directly sparked the First Anglo-Maratha War, which dragged on for years until 1782.
That war finally ends with the Treaty of Salbai in 1782, kicking off 20 years of peace. But here is the tragic historical irony of that peace. During those 2 decades, the English used the time to consolidate their power, build up their resources, and modernize. The Marathas? They spent those exact same 20 years consumed by their own internal regional squabbles.
Now for Part 4, the final Maratha defeats. This internal chaos leads us directly into the final, fatal clashes with the British East India Company.
By the time the Second Anglo-Maratha War kicked off in 1803, the Marathas were completely divided, and the British brilliantly exploited this fracture. They didn't have to fight one unified Maratha army. Instead, they fought the regional Sardars individually, forcing subsidiary alliance treaties on every single one of them. The Peshwa at Bassein, Scindia at Surji Arjangaon, Bhonsle at Deogaon, and Holkar at Rajpur Ghat. The entire empire was literally dismantled piece by piece.
And all of this culminates in the Third Anglo-Maratha War in 1818. Peshwa Nana Sahib finally realized the massive mistake of submitting to British dominance and decided to make a stand, attacking the Pune Residency. But it was just too little, too late. Governor-General Lord Hastings sent in a massive military force. He initially used the excuse of suppressing a revolt by the Pindaris, but ultimately used that army to integrate the entire Maratha state into the British Bombay Presidency. Just like that, the empire was gone.
Finally, Part 5. Why the Marathas lost. Let's distill all of this history into the core reasons for their defeat. How did such a dominant power completely collapse?
Let's break this down. First up, the economics. The Maratha economy relied incredibly heavily on traditional revenue collection, specifically those regional taxes, like Chauth and the Sardish Mukhi, which was an extra 10% tax. But they were facing off against the English, who were fueled by the massive global economic engine of the Industrial Revolution. The Marathas simply did not have the capitalist financial system required to compete on that kind of scale.
Then you have the military side of things. The Marathas were aspiring to be this all-India power, much like the Mughals, but they were caught in an awkward transition. They still relied heavily on traditional weapons and guerrilla tactics. Their military, while definitely trained, was pretty undisciplined compared to the modern, highly regimented warfare tactics utilized by the British forces. It just wasn't a fair match.
But honestly, the most damaging deficit might have been psychological and structural. Because power had been decentralized to those regional families we talked about, there was a severe lack of unified nationalism. As the source material so beautifully puts it, the Marathas had many flags within a flag. They were fighting for their own regional interests, competing against a British adversary that marched uniformly under a single, unified, one flag.
When you really boil it all down, this whole epic clash represents a massive turning point in world history. It was ultimately the failure of feudalistic forces trying to compete against capitalistic forces. A decentralized, agrarian-based military alliance simply could not withstand a centralized, industrialized, modern capitalist war machine.
So that leaves us with a pretty fascinating what-if of history. Think about it. If the Marathas had maintained the centralized structure of Shivaji's Ashtapradhan, if they had united under one flag instead of splintering after Panipat, could a unified Maratha Empire have actually withstood the forces of capitalism and modern warfare to rule India? It's a question that really shows us just how deeply structural disunity can change the entire course of human history. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep learning.